Picture a professional sports league on the edge of extinction. Franchises bleeding money, owners quietly asking each other which teams should be folded, which ones should be merged, which cities should simply be abandoned. A championship series, the single biggest event of the season, considered so unmarketable that a national television network refused to air it live. Instead, they showed it on tape delay, late at night, after the local news, once the audience that mattered had gone to bed. And then, over the course of 12 months, everything changed. A new man took the wheel. A rivalry reached its boiling point in the greatest championship series ever contested. A single draft delivered more all-time greatness in one afternoon than most decades produce. And a skinny kid from North Carolina walked through the door and quietly began rewriting what was possible for a human being in a pair of sneakers. This is the story of the National Basketball Association in 1984, the year the league stopped dying and started becoming an empire. In this video, we break down exactly what happened during the most important 12 months in NBA history. The man who inherited a wreck and turned it into a global juggernaut. The 7-game war between Boston and Los Angeles that had grown men fighting on the floor of a boiling arena. The draft class that produced a dream, a king, a round mound, and a man who had come to be called the greatest of all time. And the marketing gamble on a rookie that changed not just basketball, but the entire relationship between sports and money forever. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand something that most casual fans never quite grasp. That almost everything you love about modern basketball, the global reach, the billion-dollar contracts, the sneaker culture, the superstar worship, all of it traces back to this one pivotal year. Pull one thread and the whole thing unravels back to 1984. But before we get to the triumph, you need to understand the desperation, because that is the only way any of this makes sense. Let us go back to the years before 1984. To understand what the NBA became, you first have to understand how close it came to never getting there at all. For most of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, the NBA was, to put it bluntly, in trouble. Serious trouble. The league had expanded and absorbed teams from the rival American Basketball Association, but growth on paper did not translate into money in the bank. Multiple franchises were operating at a loss. Attendance in some markets was embarrassing, arenas half empty, the crowd noise thin and echoing. Behind closed doors, the conversations among ownership were not about how to grow the game. They were about survival. About whether the league should contract, about whether some teams could be salvaged at all. Then there was the image problem, and this one cut deep. Cocaine had swept through professional sports in that era, and the NBA in particular had become the public face of it, fairly or not. The perception, whispered in boardrooms and printed in newspapers, was that the league was too wild, too undisciplined, that too many of its players were using drugs, and that the salaries were spiraling out of control, even though by later standards, the average paycheck was modest. There was an ugly racial subtext running underneath a lot of that criticism. A coded discomfort with a league that was predominantly black, in a country that was not ready to celebrate it. Advertisers stayed away, sponsors kept their distance. The product was seen as toxic. And nothing captured that toxicity more clearly than the Kiki tape delay. Think about what that meant. The finals, the crown jewel of the sport, was shown to much of the country not live but recorded and broadcast in the dead of night. A network had looked at the biggest games the league could offer and decided they were not worth a primetime slot. That is not a minor insult, that is a verdict. That is a major American sport being told, in effect, that nobody cares. But something had already begun to shift. Something planted 5 years earlier that was about to bloom. In 1979, 2 rookies had entered the league who would come to define everything that followed. From the cornfields of Indiana came Larry Bird, a pale, unassuming forward with a deadly jump shot, a genius basketball mind, and a competitive streak that bordered on cruelty. And from Michigan State, all smiles and flash and impossible passes, came Irvin Johnson, a 6'9" guard the likes of which the sport had never seen. A man they simply called Magic. They already hated each other, in the way that only 2 people chasing the exact same thing can. They had met in the 1979 college championship game, Bird's undefeated Indiana State against Magic's Michigan State, in what remains one of the most watched basketball games ever played. Magic won that night. Bird never forgot it, and when they both arrived in the NBA that same year, they brought their rivalry with them, and they brought something the league had been missing: a story, a reason to watch. A pair of contrasting characters that even people who did not follow basketball could understand and take a side on. For 5 years, that rivalry simmered. Bird won a title with Boston in 1981. Magic won titles with Los Angeles in 1980 and 1982. But they had never actually met in the finals. The two biggest stars in the sport, the two men single-handedly dragging the league back toward relevance, and fate kept pulling them apart at the last moment. The public wanted the collision. The league needed the collision, and in 1984, at long last, they got it. But before Bird and Magic could go to war, a quieter revolution took place in a league office in New York. A revolution led by a man whose face most fans would not have recognized, but whose fingerprints would end up on everything. On February 1st, 1984, the NBA got a new commissioner. His name was David Stern. He was 41 years old, the son of a man who ran a delicatessen in New York City, a lawyer by training who had first worked for the league as outside counsel and then risen through its ranks as general counsel and executive vice president. He was not a former player. He was not a towering physical presence. He was a sharp, relentless, detail-obsessed operator who saw the league not as a collection of basketball games, but as a business, a brand, and a story waiting to be told properly. Stern took over from Larry O'Brien, becoming just the 4th commissioner in league history. And the situation he inherited was, by his own later account, dire. He would describe those early days in stark terms, admitting that the league was barely surviving and that the whole enterprise felt precarious. He walked into a job many would have considered a poisoned chalice. A dying league, a damaged reputation, a championship product that could not even get a live broadcast. Most people in that position would have played defense, would have tried to stop the bleeding and hold on. Stern did the opposite. He looked at the exact same league that everyone else saw as a liability, and he saw an untapped goldmine. He understood something that his predecessors had not fully grasped, that the NBA's greatest assets were not its franchises or its arenas. They were its people, its stars, the larger-than-life characters wearing the uniforms, and he had already been laying the groundwork before he ever took the top job. As an executive, Stern had been instrumental in negotiations that reshaped the league's entire financial structure. The collective bargaining agreement of that era introduced something revolutionary: a salary cap tied directly to league revenues, a system that effectively made the owners and the players partners in the same enterprise. When the league made money, everyone shared in it, and struggling franchises were protected from being crushed by richer ones. It was in many ways the financial foundation that everything else would be built on. He had also pushed hard on the drug problem, understanding that the league would never win back corporate America while it was seen as a haven for cocaine. An anti-drug program had been put in place to clean up the image and reassure nervous sponsors, and Stern would go on to enforce it with an iron hand, handing down lifetime bans to players who crossed the line and sending an unmistakable message about what would be tolerated on his watch. But his real genius was in marketing. Stern grasped earlier and more completely than almost anyone that people do not fall in love with a league. They fall in love with people. And he had, sitting right there in his lap, two of the most marketable stars in the history of American sport, on a collision course that was finally about to happen. All he had to do was package it and sell it to a country ready to care. He inherited the rivalry. He did not create it, but he understood its value in a way nobody before him had, and he built an entire empire around it. And in his very first months on the job, that rivalry was about to hand him the greatest advertisement he could ever have asked for. Because the 1983 and 1984 season was barreling toward a conclusion that the league had been waiting 5 years to see. Larry Bird was in the middle of the finest stretch of his career. That season, he was named the league's most valuable player, the first of what would become 3 straight most valuable player awards, a run of dominance that has not been matched by anyone since. He was the engine of a Boston Celtics team that finished with the best record in the entire league. 62 wins against just 20 losses, the top seed in the Eastern Conference. Around Bird, general manager Red Auerbach had assembled a genuine juggernaut. The front line alone was terrifying, with Bird joined by the skilled and merciless Kevin McHale and the towering Robert Parrish. A trio so good, it would come to be remembered as one of the greatest front courts ever put on a floor. Add the steely veteran guard Dennis Johnson, brought in to be the defensive anchor and the man who took the biggest shots, and you had a team built for exactly one thing: winning a championship. Out west, the Los Angeles Lakers were something else entirely. Where Boston was gritty and physical and blue-collar, Los Angeles was dazzling. They called it Showtime, and it was the perfect name. Fast breaks that ended in impossible finishes, no-look passes, a run-and-gun style choreographed by Magic Johnson at the controls and finished by a roster loaded with talent. There was the ageless Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the all-time great center whose skyhook was the most unstoppable shot in the sport. There was the young and explosive James Worthy, the smooth Jamal Wilkes, the sharpshooting Byron Scott, the tireless defender Michael Cooper, and the veteran scorer Bob McAdoo coming off the bench. Coached by the slick, silver-haired Pat Riley, who dressed like a movie star and coached like a general, the Lakers were the glamour team of the Glamour City. They were the 80s in basketball form. The two teams tore through their respective conferences. Boston had to survive a grueling 7-game war against the New York Knicks and the explosive scoring of Bernard King in the second round before finally handling the Milwaukee Bucks to claim the East. Los Angeles rolled through the West, dispatching the Phoenix Suns to reach the finals. And so it was set. The matchup the sport had been starving for. Bird against Magic. Boston against Los Angeles. The Celtics and the Lakers, two franchises that had met in the finals many times across the decades, but never with these two men leading the way. Never with the whole country watching and choosing sides. It was more than a basketball series. It was a clash of cultures, East versus West, old money versus new, substance versus style, the blue-collar grinder against the Hollywood showman. And when the ball went up for Game 1 on May 27, 1984, the NBA was about to put on the greatest show it had ever staged. What followed was 7 games of war. The drama started immediately. The Lakers struck first, walking into the ancient hostile Boston Garden and stealing Game 1 behind a masterful performance from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who poured in 32 points to silence the crowd. Home court advantage gone, just like that. And it nearly got worse. In Game 2, the Lakers were seconds away from taking a commanding 2-0 lead. Los Angeles had the ball, needing only to run out the clock. And then came the moment that may have saved Boston's entire season. Celtics guard Gerald Henderson read a lazy, careless pass from James Worthy, jumped the passing lane, stole the ball, and laid it in to tie the game with the clock winding down. The Garden erupted. The Lakers, who had been one possession from a stranglehold on the series, were suddenly headed to overtime, and Boston finished the job to win it, 124-121. Instead of trailing by 2 games, the series was even. It was the kind of swing that changes everything. One careless moment punished by a great team, and the Lakers would spend the rest of the series haunted by how close they had come. The team split the next 2 games in Los Angeles, but Game 3 revealed just how dangerous the Lakers could be when Showtime was truly humming. Magic Johnson orchestrated a demolition, handing out 21 assists, a finals record at the time, as the Lakers ran the Celtics off their own floor. Boston looked slow, overwhelmed, outclassed. And that is when the series turned ugly in the way that only the greatest rivalries can, because in Game 4, the Celtics decided they were not going to be run out of the building again. If they could not beat the Lakers at the fast break, they would slow the fast break down by force. The defining moment came when Kevin McHale caught Kurt Rambis on a Los Angeles break and clotheslined him, hard, sending Rambis crashing to the floor in a heap. It was not a basketball play. It was a message. The genteel finesse series was over. Now it was a fight, and the physical, brawling Celtics were far more comfortable in that kind of war than the run-and-gun Lakers were. Boston won Game 4 in overtime to even the series again, and the tone had been set. Los Angeles had been knocked out of their rhythm, and they never fully found it again. Then came Game 5, and Game 5 became a legend all on its own, for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the weather. The Boston Garden was an old building with no air conditioning, and on the day of Game 5, the temperature inside that arena climbed to something close to 97 degrees. It was an oven. The players were dripping, gasping, wilting. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, 37 years old and playing enormous minutes, was reduced to sucking on an oxygen mask on the bench between possessions just to keep going. And in that suffocating heat, Larry Bird was unbothered. He was a cold-weather kid from Indiana who seemed to thrive in the misery, dropping 34 points as the Celtics baked the Lakers alive and took a lead of 3-2. They still call it the Heat game, and it broke Los Angeles down not just physically but mentally. The Lakers fought back to win Game 6 on their home floor, forcing a 7th and deciding game. And so it all came down to one night, June 12, 1984. Game 7, back in the Boston Garden, in front of a frenzied crowd, with a championship and 5 years of history on the line. Bird had willed his team to this moment, but on the final night, he got all the help he needed. Cedric Maxwell, who had reportedly told his teammates to climb on his back, delivered a magnificent performance, leading all scorers with 24 points. Dennis Johnson added 22. Robert Parrish controlled the interior with 14 points and 16 rebounds. And Bird himself contributed 20 points and a mountain of rebounds. Boston pulled away down the stretch, and when the final buzzer sounded, the Celtics had won it. 111-102. Their 15th championship in franchise history. And revenge for Bird, at last, over the man who had beaten him in college 5 years before. For the series, Bird had been magnificent, averaging over 27 points and 14 rebounds per game, and he was the runaway choice for Finals' Most Valuable Player. He had shared the floor with 9 other future Hall of Famers, and he had outplayed every one of them. Magic Johnson, by contrast, endured a nightmare, making several crucial errors in the biggest moments. Mistakes that would gnaw at him for a full year until he got the chance to answer them. But step back from the individual glory and look at what the series meant for the league itself. This was the advertisement David Stern could never have bought. 2 iconic franchises, 2 transcendent stars, a genuine cultural war between coasts, 7 games of unbearable tension, including overtimes and brawls, and a game played in an inferno. The whole country watched. The ratings climbed, and crucially, people who did not even care about basketball found themselves caring about this. The tape delay era was over. The NBA was live, it was must-see, and it had delivered the finest championship series it had ever produced at the exact moment it needed it most. The rivalry that Stern inherited had proven its worth beyond his wildest hopes. And incredibly, that was not even the biggest thing that happened to the NBA in 1984. Because 1 week after Game 7, the league held a draft. And that draft would go down as the single greatest collection of talent ever assembled in one night. On June 19, 1984, at the Felt Forum inside Madison Square Garden, the NBA held what would become the most famous draft in the history of the sport. To this day, when people argue about the greatest draft class ever, the conversation begins and ends here. 4 future Hall of Famers came off the board, 7 future All-Stars, and the entire trajectory of the league for the next 2 decades was quietly determined over the space of a single afternoon. The Houston Rockets held the #1 overall pick, having won a coin flip for the right to draft first, and they used it on a player who would justify every ounce of the hype. Hakeem Olajuwon, born in Nigeria, a graceful, agile giant out of the University of Houston who had grown up playing soccer and moved with a fluidity that no 7-footer had any business possessing. They would call him the Dream, and he would become arguably the greatest center the game has ever seen. A 2-time champion, a 2-time Finals Most Valuable Player, a League Most Valuable Player, and the all-time leader in blocked shots. For Houston, who already had the towering Ralph Sampson, pairing the two created a front court proudly nicknamed the Twin Towers. It was a franchise-altering selection, and by any reasonable measure the correct one. And then came the pick that would live in infamy forever. The Portland Trail Blazers held the #2 selection. And Portland had a decision to make. There was a guard out of the University of North Carolina, the reigning college player of the year, a player who had already hit the game-winning shot in a national championship game as a freshman, a young man whose ceiling nobody could quite measure. His name was Michael Jordan. But Portland already had a talented young shooting guard on its roster in Clyde Drexler, and the team convinced itself that what it truly needed was a center. So the Trailblazers passed on Michael Jordan. They used the second overall pick on Sam Bowie, a big man from Kentucky whose career would be repeatedly derailed by injuries. It is, to this day, the most second-guessed decision in the history of professional sports. And while it is easy to mock in hindsight, the logic was not insane at the time. Portland genuinely needed size. Bowie was a legitimately skilled 7-footer, and nobody could have predicted that the player still on the board was about to become the most famous athlete who would ever live. But that is exactly what happened. And every time Michael Jordan hit a game winner or defied gravity for the next 15 years, the ghost of that decision haunted the city of Portland. Because with the third overall pick, the Chicago Bulls, a struggling and largely irrelevant franchise, selected Michael Jordan, and nothing about the NBA, or about sports, or about the global business of athletic celebrity would ever be the same again. But the greatness of the 1984 draft did not stop with the top three. Not even close. With the fourth pick, the Dallas Mavericks took Sam Perkins, Jordan's teammate from North Carolina, a steady and durable forward who would enjoy a long and productive career. And then, with the fifth pick, the Philadelphia 76ers landed a force of nature. Charles Barkley, a wide, powerful, impossibly charismatic forward out of Auburn, who was listed at barely 6'6", but who rebounded like a giant and played with a fury that belied his rounded frame. They called him the Round Mound of Rebound, and later simply Sir Charles, and he would become one of the most dominant power forwards and beloved personalities the game has ever known. A league most valuable player in his own right, and one of the few men capable of standing toe-to-toe with Jordan. And the value kept coming, deep into the draft, long after the cameras had lost interest. Because with the 16th overall pick, in a slot that generates no headlines and no fanfare, the Utah Jazz selected a slight, unassuming point guard from a small school called Gonzaga. His name was John Stockton. He did not look like much. He would go on to become the greatest pure passer the league has ever seen, the all-time leader in assists and in steals, records so far ahead of everyone else that they may never be broken. The perfect complement to Karl Malone in a partnership that would define the Jazz for a generation. 4 Hall of Famers: Olajuwon, Jordan, Barkley, and Stockton. And beyond them, more genuine talent and additional all-stars like Kevin Willis, Otis Thorpe, and Alvin Robertson scattered throughout the rounds. It was an absurd concentration of ability, an alignment of the stars the league has never seen again. In one single evening, the NBA had restocked itself with the very players who would carry it into its golden age. The championship series had proven the league's present was thrilling. The draft had guaranteed its future would be historic. And at the center of that future, wearing a Chicago Bulls uniform he had not even wanted at first, was the young man from North Carolina. Because the final chapter of the NBA's transformative year belonged to him. When the calendar turned to the fall of 1984, Michael Jordan was still just a rookie. An unproven one. Enormously talented, yes, and already carrying a reputation, but he had not yet played a single professional game. The Chicago Bulls he joined were a mess. A losing team in a city that had largely stopped paying attention to them. Nobody in that autumn was calling Michael Jordan the greatest of all time. That title had to be earned, one impossible night at a time, over the years that lay ahead. But something happened before he ever laced up in a real game that would prove almost as important as anything he did on the court. A sportswear company took an enormous gamble on him. Nike at the time was not the untouchable colossus it would later become. It was a company looking for an edge, and its representatives made an aggressive play to sign the rookie, building an entire line of shoes and apparel around him personally. This was not how things were done. Rookies did not get signature shoes. Unproven players did not have brands constructed around them before they had accomplished anything. But someone at Nike saw what David Stern had seen, that this sport was about to be sold on the backs of its individual stars, and that this young man might be the most marketable human being to ever bounce a basketball. That gamble, born in 1984, would create a line of sneakers that generated fortunes almost beyond calculation and reshaped the relationship between athletes, brands, and culture. The idea of the athlete as a global commercial icon, the shoe deal worth more than the playing contract, all of it traces back to a BET placed on a rookie in that pivotal year. And then, on October 26, 1984, Michael Jordan finally played. He made his professional debut against the Washington Bullets, scoring 16 points as the Bulls won. It was a solid start, nothing earth-shattering, but it was the first step of the longest and most famous journey any athlete has ever taken. And in a beautiful piece of symmetry, he was not alone. That very same night, both Charles Barkley and John Stockton also made their NBA debuts. 3 of the 4 Hall of Famers from that legendary draft class stepping onto the professional stage for the very first time on the very same evening. The future arriving all at once. Jordan would go on to win Rookie of the Year that season, an immediate signal of what was to come. And over the 15 years that followed, he would win 6 championships, 5 League Most Valuable Player awards, 6 Finals Most Valuable Player awards, and turn the NBA into something no basketball league had ever been. A worldwide phenomenon, a brand recognized in every corner of the earth, the vehicle through which the game conquered the planet. But all of that was still in the future. In 1984, he was simply a rookie, taking his first steps, one of countless threads that came together in a single miraculous year to pull a league back from the grave. So step back and take in the full picture. When you lay it all out, the density of it is almost hard to believe. In the span of roughly 12 months, the NBA hired the commissioner who would spend the next 30 years turning it into a multi-billion-dollar global empire. It staged the greatest championship series in its history, a 7-game classic between its 2 most iconic franchises and its 2 most marketable superstars, at the precise moment it needed a signature event to win back the country. It held the single greatest draft ever assembled, welcoming 4 future Hall of Famers, including the man who would become the most famous athlete on the planet. And it witnessed the birth of the sneaker deal and the athlete as global icon, a commercial revolution that would change sports forever. Any one of those things would have made 1984 a memorable year. All of them together, packed into the same 12 months, make it the most important year the league has ever had. It was the hinge upon which the entire history of the NBA turns. Everything before it was the story of a struggling regional sport, fighting for survival. Everything after it was the story of a global juggernaut on an unstoppable rise. And what is most remarkable is how much of it came down to timing. The rivalry between Bird and Magic had been building for 5 years, and it happened to peak in the same season that David Stern took office. The greatest draft class of all time happened to arrive in the same summer. Michael Jordan and the Nike gamble happened to land in the same autumn. It was as if every piece the league would need for its golden age had been gathered up and dropped into place across a single revolutionary year. Of course, the story did not end there. The very next year, in 1985, Magic and the Lakers would get their revenge, finally beating the Celtics in the finals and beginning to even a score in a rivalry that would define the decade. Jordan would spend years being battered by rugged Detroit and Boston teams before he learned how to win it all. Olajuwon would carry Houston to the mountaintop the following decade. The seeds planted in 1984 would take years, even decades, to fully bloom. But they were planted in 1984, every last one of them. The commissioner, the rivalry at its peak, the draft, the icon, the shoe, the business model. The dying league that could not get its championship on live television became, within a single generation, one of the most valuable sports properties on Earth. And it all pivots on this one hinge in history, when everything that had been building for years arrived at once, and everything that would follow was set in motion. For once, there was no single savior and no single turning point. It was bigger than that. Stern gave the league direction. Bird and Magic gave it a rivalry people could not look away from. The draft supplied an entire generation of stars. Jordan gave it a new kind of icon, one whose influence would eventually reach far beyond basketball. Nike saw what an athlete could become as a brand. Television saw what the NBA could become as entertainment. Separately, each of those developments mattered. Together, arriving in the same year, they completely changed the trajectory of the sport. That is why 1984 matters. Not because of any single moment, but because of the impossible convergence of all of them. The year the NBA stopped fighting for survival and started building an empire. The year the modern game was born. The next time you watch a superstar sign a contract worth hundreds of millions, or see a signature sneaker sell out around the world, or watch the finals broadcast live to a global audience of hundreds of millions of people, remember where it started. Remember the dying league on tape delay. Remember the new commissioner who saw gold where everyone else saw ruin. Remember Bird and Magic finally colliding in a boiling old arena. Remember the greatest draft ever held. Remember the skinny rookie from North Carolina taking his first steps in a city that had almost stopped caring. Remember the year that changed everything.